The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, a place where everyone, no matter their background, was treated with respect. But today, something was different. Judge Malcolm Carter, known for his fairness and commanding presence, took his seat at the bench, ready to begin the day's cases. But before he could even get started, a tense energy filled the room. All eyes shifted to Officer Rebecca Mills, a veteran cop who had just walked in with a smug look on her face. She was here to testify, but her demeanor was anything but professional. From the moment she stepped inside, it was clear she had no intention of showing respect. She barely glanced at the judge, answering questions with short, dismissive responses. And when Judge Carter calmly asked her to clarify her statement, she did something no one expected. She rolled her eyes and scoffed. A hushed gasp spread through the courtroom. Had she really just disrespected a sitting judge like that? And not just any judge, a black judge who had worked his entire life to break barriers in the justice system. The tension grew thicker as Judge Carter remained composed, his deep gaze locked onto the officer. He had seen disrespect in his courtroom before, but this felt different. This wasn't just arrogance, there was something else behind it. But instead of reacting in anger, he chose a different approach, one that would change everything. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom speechless. No one, especially Officer Mills, was prepared for the powerful moment that was about to unfold. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The courtroom remained silent, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Carter took a slow breath, his expression calm but unreadable. He had faced difficult situations before, but this was different. There was something about Officer Mills' attitude, something deeper than just arrogance. He could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at him, the way she carried herself as if she was above this courtroom, above the very law she had sworn to uphold. The other attorneys and officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone felt it. This wasn't just a routine case. Something unspoken was hanging in the air, and it was about to come to the surface. Judge Carter glanced down at the file in front of him, scanning the details of the case. Officer Mills had been called in as a key witness in a dispute involving a routine traffic stop gone wrong. A young black man had been pulled over, and what should have been a simple exchange had escalated into something far more serious. There were accusations of excessive force, conflicting testimonies, and now all eyes were on this courtroom to see how justice would be served. But instead of treating the moment with the seriousness it deserved, Officer Mills stood there, arms crossed, an almost defiant smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. The tension between her and Judge Carter wasn't just about this case, it was personal. Had they crossed paths before? Had something happened between them outside of this courtroom? The way she looked at him, the way he studied her in return, it was clear there was more to this story than anyone knew. And then, just as the silence threatened to break under the weight of unspoken words, Judge Carter leaned forward. His voice was steady, but his next words would change everything. Judge Carter's voice cut through the silence, firm yet controlled. "Officer Mills, do you understand the seriousness of this testimony?" His eyes locked onto hers, searching for any sign of acknowledgement, but she barely flinched. Instead, she shifted her weight, her stance rigid, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," she responded, her tone clipped, lacking any real respect. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Attorney Lissa Thompson, representing the young man at the center of the case, studied Officer Mills carefully. She had handled plenty of cases involving questionable police conduct, but this one felt different. The way Officer Mills carried herself, the quiet hostility in her voice, it wasn't just about this case. It was about something bigger. Lissa glanced over at her client, Marcus Reynolds, a college student who had never been in trouble with the law before. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly, his eyes darting between the officer and the judge. He had been accused of resisting arrest, but his version of events told a different story, one of fear, confusion, and an officer who had escalated a simple traffic stop into something far worse. And now, standing in front of them, was the same officer who had been at the center of it all. Officer Mills had made the arrest, filed the report, and now she was on the stand, defensive, unshaken, and unwilling to admit that anything had gone wrong that night. Judge Carter took another measured breath. He had seen officers like her before, those who carried an unspoken belief that their authority placed them above reproach. But this time, it was happening in his courtroom, under his watch. "Tell me again, Officer Mills," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Did you have probable cause to initiate that stop?" The question hung in the air. The entire courtroom leaned in, waiting. But it was the flicker of something in Officer Mills' eyes, hesitation, doubt, or maybe something even deeper, that sent a ripple through the room. And just like that, the tension grew even thicker, with no sign of breaking. Officer Mills' lips parted slightly, as if she were about to answer. But for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, she hesitated. It was subtle, just a brief flicker of uncertainty. But Judge Carter caught it immediately. So did Lisa Thompson. Even Marcus, sitting silently at the defense table, seemed to notice. The pause was enough to send a wave of murmurs through the gallery. People shifted in their seats, waiting. It wasn't just about her answer anymore. It was about what that hesitation meant. Finally, Officer Mills straightened her shoulders and cleared her throat. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice sharper this time, more controlled. "The vehicle had a broken taillight. That gave me probable cause to pull him over." Judge Carter's gaze didn't waver. "And after approaching the vehicle, what led you to escalate the situation?" Officer Mills inhaled deeply, her fingers tightening into a fist at her side. The suspect, she glanced toward Marcus, was acting nervous. He kept reaching around inside the car. "Given recent cases of officers being harmed during traffic stops, I had reason to be cautious." Lisa Thompson leaned forward, her expression unreadable, but inside, she was taking in every word. "Acting nervous," she echoed. "Officer Mills, wouldn't you say that being pulled over at night, by yourself, might make anyone a little nervous, especially a young black man?" A sharp silence followed. Officer Mills didn't answer right away. Her jaw twitched. Judge Carter let the question hang in the air before speaking again. "Officer Mills, let's be clear. Was there any visible weapon? Any direct threat that justified force?" The room was so quiet it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. Officer Mills hesitated. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Officer Mills' face paled just slightly, but she didn't move. Judge Carter took the folder, flipping it open. His expression remained unreadable as his eyes scanned the transcript inside. The silence stretched long enough that the tension became unbearable. Then, finally, he looked up. "Play the footage," he ordered. The bailiff moved swiftly, connecting the courtroom's screen to the evidence system. A moment later, the video flickered to life. The grainy nighttime footage showed Marcus sitting in his car, both hands gripping the steering wheel, his voice tense but calm as he repeatedly asked why he had been pulled over. Officer Mills' voice came through next, sharp, demanding, laced with something else beneath the surface. But then something unexpected happened. Another officer stepped into the frame, someone who hadn't been mentioned before. He leaned toward Officer Mills, whispering something just out of the camera's audio range. And in that moment, Mills' entire demeanor changed. Her stance became more aggressive, her tone more forceful. The situation escalated, not because of Marcus, but because of something that had been said between those officers. Judge Carter's expression darkened. Lisa Thompson's lips pressed into a firm line. Marcus sat frozen, his breath shallow. Officer Mills didn't move. She didn't blink. Because she knew, whatever had been whispered that night, whatever had pushed her to take things further, it was about to come to light. And once it did, there would be no going back. The courtroom was deathly silent. Every eye was locked on the screen, watching as the footage played out in real time. The whispered words from the unseen officer couldn't be heard, but the impact was clear. The moment Officer Mills had turned aggressive, the moment the situation had escalated, it hadn't been about Marcus at all. It had been something else, something more calculated. Judge Carter's gaze flickered toward Officer Mills. Officer Mills, who is that officer? And what did he say to you? For the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled. Her fingers twitched at her side. I don't recall, Your Honor, she said, but her voice lacked the defiance from before. Lisa Thompson stepped forward, her voice steady. Your Honor, this officer was never mentioned in any report. Officer Mills' account made it seem like she was acting alone, but this footage suggests otherwise. The judge's expression hardened. Officer Mills, I'll ask you one more time. Who is he? A heavy silence stretched between them. Everyone could feel it, she was cornered. Then, a new voice spoke from the gallery. I can tell you who he is. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as a man stood up from the back row. He was tall, dressed in civilian clothes, but the badge clipped to his belt was unmistakable. Detective Harris, he introduced himself, stepping forward. I was assigned to an internal investigation about this very case. Officer Mills' face drained of color. Judge Carter gestured for him to continue. That officer, Harris said, pointing at the screen, is Sergeant Bill Landry. He's been under scrutiny for months for influencing officers on the field, manipulating traffic stops, and escalating minor incidents, especially involving young black men. He paused, letting his words sink in. And Officer Mills, she wasn't acting alone. She was following orders. The room exploded in whispers. Judge Carter's gaze was steel. Is this true, Officer Mills? Mills swallowed hard. The fight was gone from her eyes. She shifted on her feet, but there was nowhere left to run. I didn't have a choice, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me to make an example out of him. A stunned silence followed. Marcus sat frozen, his breath catching in his throat. All this time, he had thought he was just another victim of a bad cop with a grudge. But this was bigger. This wasn't just about one officer's bias, it was a system, a chain of command designed to target people like him. Judge Carter let the weight of the moment settle before speaking. His voice was firm, unwavering. Officer Mills, you had a choice. And now you'll face the consequences of it. But just as the courtroom braced for what would come next, Detective Harris added one last thing, something no one expected. There's more, he said, his voice low. Sergeant Landry isn't acting alone either. There are others involved. The tension, which had seemed ready to break, tightened all over again. The case wasn't just about Officer Mills anymore. This was just the beginning. The weight of Detective Harris' words settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud. The case had started as one officer's questionable actions, but now it was clear this went far beyond Officer Mills. A system had been working behind the scenes, manipulating officers, targeting individuals like Marcus, and covering it up under the guise of routine police work. Judge Carter exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned back to Officer Mills, who stood frozen, staring at the floor. Officer Mills, do you understand the severity of what you've just admitted? She nodded stiffly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Lisa Thompson, who had fought tirelessly for Marcus, studied Mills for a long moment. Why now? She asked. Why admit it? Mills hesitated. For the first time, she looked less like the arrogant officer who had walked into the courtroom and more like someone who had been caught in something far beyond her control. Because I know what happens if I don't, she admitted. Landry protects his own, but if you cross him, you become the target. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The truth was out now, but that didn't change what had happened to him. The fear he had felt that night, the way his life could have been ruined over something he never even did, that stayed with him. Judge Carter straightened in his seat. Detective Harris, I trust that this investigation will continue. Harris nodded. It already has, Your Honor. Judge Carter looked over at Marcus, then back at Mills. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability, and that starts today. With those final words, the gavel came down. The court